Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining the Resilient Supply Chain, Adopting for an Automated and Digitized World with Heidi Benko, VP of Solution Strategy for Infor Supply Chain Management. As a reminder, if you have any questions throughout the conversation, please submit them using the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. Here's your host, Deborah Weinswig, CEO and founder of Coresight Research.
Thanks so much, Drew, and good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's conversation. With that, I'm very honored to introduce Heidi Benko. Heidi has 20 years of experience in supply chain product management and marketing. Her roles throughout the years have allowed her to deliver innovative supply chain network solutions, helping companies transform their supply chain operations and finance strategies. As VP Solution Strategy and Marketing at Infor, Heidi is responsible for product marketing, strategy, messaging, and positioning of Infor Supply Chain. In her role at Infor, she's a driving force behind their hero supply chain product Nexus, a multi-enterprise supply chain network that connects companies with their supply chain partners to provide visibility, collaboration, and process automation from plan to shipment and through to payment. Heidi joined Infor in 2015 via the acquisition of GT Nexus. Heidi, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
Thank you. So supply chain is on the tip of everyone's tongues, especially as we go into holiday. And this word resilience throughout, kind of the pandemic has, really, I think, been the hallmark of what so many of us kind of fold up as best in class. If we think about those two together, how do you define a resilient supply chain?
Yep. And just simply stated, basically with all those changes and everything going on, a resilient supply chain is one that can quickly respond to and also withstand all these major shifts and shocks that we're seeing in supply chain, right? And obviously, we're the biggest shock that we've seen in a while going on now, right? So companies are really, how do they keep running their business in this new world? So that's a resilient supply chain.
What's really interesting is, right, we've seen over the past 18 to 24 months this rise of the chief supply chain officer, and kind of retailers and brands have really understood the value of investing more in the supply chain, focusing more on the supply chain, and then even hiring somebody into the C-suite, and that's their kind of 24/7 focus in terms of where to invest and how to invest. How have you seen retailers use supply chains as a competitive advantage?
Yep. So I think the past few years we've heard a lot on the retail side where the focus has really been on final mile customer experience, customer engagement, flexible fulfillment, right? But what we've seen, really to enable that and deliver that, companies need to not just focus, digital transformation in those areas, but in their end-to-end supply chains, right? So that is why supply chains become so important, right? To enable that level of flexibility in supply chain and getting the right product to where it needs to be, companies need to transform the supply chains that they have today, right? So they need to, be able to sense and predict the latest demand, so they can plan to have the right product at the right channel. And then they need a digitally transformed to enable that, visibility and agility around their supply chain and supply, so that way they can get that right product to that right place at the right time and at the best cost.
How, you talk about flexible fulfillment. How do you think about that?
Just, am I going to pick it up in store? Am I going to, ship direct, ship from warehouse, drop ships, and then even broader in supply chain, drop ships from supply chain, direct ships. So taking that even broader than just that last mile fulfillment, I think is critical.
Great. And, I think that, as we think about this idea of flexibility, so many of these retailers this year have really had to kind of rethink supply chains and really from kind of cotton field to shelf and everything in between, and we've really seen this kind of amazing digital transformation occur as well. We always hear about kind of the customer interaction and faster, more flexible fulfillment, but what are you seeing regarding digital transformation in supply chain?
Yeah. So a number of things, again, to support that customer experience and that flexible fulfillment, you need to have a supply chain that can plan where that product needs to be, and to assure that supply gets where it needs to be. So a number of things that we're seeing. One is first on the planning side, right? If you think about the short cycle times, the number of SKUs, and the variability of demand today with so many different influences, whether it's weather, whether it's TikTok or Instagram, all these different influencers processing all this data to get a better plan, is really, legacy planning systems weren't set up for that. And some companies are even still using spreadsheets. So what we're seeing is now then more than ever, it's important to have modern planning systems and really machine learning based planning so that you have an unlimited number of attributes that you can really sense demand and plan accordingly, right? And then cloud-based, so it's scalable, and you can't wait 24 hours for things to run. Retailers need real-time continuous planning to figure out that latest demand, right? And COVID certainly heightened that as well. With all the changes, that demand variability is changing greatly. And then on the supply side, to make sure that I have that product and where it needs to be, companies really need end-to-end visibility in their supply chain. So that way, when they have that latest demand signal, they can reorchestrate the supply to where it needs to be. So I need that flexibility in my supply chain. I need visibility where it is. And then overall, that digital transformation, it is about getting, flexible fulfillment and a customer experience so they get that right product to the right place, but certainly at the best cost as well, right? So efficiency is certainly very important to supply chain. So how do I do that? By reducing overall costs in my supply chain, increasing productivity as well. So digitally transforming all aspects of their supply chain.
You bring up an important point, which is many of these kind of legacy supply chain systems and kind of moving from analog to digital. It can be overwhelming. How do companies think about just getting started? And once again, I think that 2020 has really highlighted for us just how critical supply chain is on so many different levels. But once again, we do find sometimes it's this oh my gosh, where do I start? And how do you think about that?
Yeah. So when we talk to companies, often we talk to them about, well, where's your biggest pain point? Where are you lacking the most visibility? Where do you have the most manual processes in your supply chain? And what we've seen, again, in a number of areas that are easy to start. One, I mentioned the forecasting, right? The planning and forecasting. So many companies that we speak to are really doing legacy planning. And in retail, you just can't do that today, right? So one of the things is to put in a modern machine learning based planning. The other thing is, 80% of data and processes and supply chain sits outside of any single enterprise company that you have to manage it. So it's very important when you think about supply chains, and most supply chains are very global. There's a number of parties involved in supply chains, document processes, and systems, right? So one of the key things is really connecting that to a network, right? So connecting your partners to a network, and that really, to get better visibility and execution in your supply chain, you need that tight connectivity, that shared visibility with all the partners, whether it's the logistics partners or the suppliers, and that collaboration. So that way, when you do plan, in order that you're sure that you can execute and ensure supply and streamline those processes and get product where it needs to be.
I think you're almost alluding to kind of one of the buzzwords we've heard in 2020, which is this idea of the collaborative supply chain network, and which I exist for collaboration and partnership. So it very much speaks to how I think about, kind of the retail world in general. But how do you think about this idea of like a collaborative supply chain network, and what does it mean to you?
Yep, absolutely. So, as I mentioned, 80% of data and processes is outside any single enterprise. And traditionally, what we've seen with companies to get visibility of what's going on in their supply chain and to share information with partners, they've traditionally done that. And with the traditional approach has been point-to-point connections of various systems. And that's not very collaborative, right? An EDI message of sharing an order, different systems, that's not even providing visibility, it's just kind of connectivity, right? And so what we find with companies and the way they've traditionally gone about connecting with their supply chain partners to get information, to share information, the information is highly latent, data silos, highly inefficient. So what a connected supply chain network does is everybody connects in one place, right? So I have shared visibility with all those partners, my logistics providers, my carrier suppliers, and banks. Everybody's looking at that single version of the truth So key is visibility, and then you can collaborate and execute on that, right? Everybody's got that same version of an order and the status of a shipment, which is really key when companies are trying to, if you're trying to get the right goods to your end customer at the right time and have that flexibility, you can't do that unless you have this really connected network with shared visibility and robust collaboration.
No, that's really critical. And one of the other questions that we're getting, and certainly much earlier this year than we have in the past, is around holiday. The feeling is that, for many, the holiday season has already started. I do think that there is, consumer and customer awareness that there are a, kind of finite amount of product. But as we think about the holiday season, what questions are you getting now? And if you think about 2020 versus 2019, how are they different, and how are companies solving these questions, and can they be solved in 2020 if they're just asking them now?
Yeah, I think they've, the last several months, we've seen with COVID that the level of uncertainty and unpredictability is extreme, right? And going into this holiday season and even after, companies see that they can't function the way they have with traditional, tools. And if you think about, again, planning, it is starting earlier, right? And, given the state of, the economy and unemployment, what are those buying patterns? Who's buying, what timing, and all of that. So it's really key, in what companies need to have part of a resilient supply chain is, again, machine learning based planning and forecasting tools, so they can take all these demands and quickly turn around better plans, right? Because it is changing and there is so much unpredictability and variability. They need the latest signals. They can't kind of plan on all that historic data, right? They need more real-time information. So companies are, how can you help me with that? Infor, to get better information and help me better plan around this. And then, I have a better plan, but how does my supply chain execute that, right? So if you don't have connectivity and visibility into the supply chain to see where product is versus demand and react to that quickly, companies aren't going to be able to be responsive enough this holiday season and on an ongoing basis.
I mean, what's really interesting, and I think that, we brought up this idea of, kind of collaboration. How have you seen retailers share, right, discuss their pain points with each other, and then share ideas on, kind of how to solve them? How has Infor played a role there? How do you just think about this idea of, everyone's really, kind of challenged in terms of this whole resilient supply chain issue? How are you finding the industry come together to solve?
I mean, everybody's looking for insights from everyone else. You do see a lot more collaboration because, again, I think over the last few years, it's been interesting what we've seen, within retail or within specific industries, but also cross industries. A lot of our customers are asking, well, what about, what are you seeing in other industries? Everybody's trying to learn best practices. And now, certainly with what we've experienced with COVID, and the unprecedented level of, either a major shift in order increases or decreases in status of supplies, companies are really like, how do I get that better visibility and responsiveness? And how do I, work better with all my supply chain partners to react to that? One of the things that we saw with COVID, if you think about just, the shortness, the amount of, capacity and logistics, right? A lot of port congestion, less capacity. Companies had supply chains that were stuck and still had to get their products where they needed to be. Being able to share visibility with their logistics partners and prioritize the right shipments and be responsive to ensure on-time sales, for instance. Another collaboration example is a good example on, with that, we talked about a collaborative supply chain network, working with other partners like banks. Right. So what we saw a lot in retail and other industries was, well, wait a minute, my demand's decreasing. I have all this inventory. I need my suppliers to hold inventory longer. I actually need to defer my payments, but I don't want to impact my suppliers. Right. So working with a network, not just of other, suppliers and partners, but the banks, we're able to bring them on the same platform, collaborate, and find ways to get the suppliers paid sooner, allowing the customers or the retailers to defer their payments to keep, everybody in the supply chain in a good place from a cash flow perspective.
That's actually, that's a phenomenal example. And I think kind of truly this idea of, everyone working together, to, also make holiday happen, which is, incredibly important. And speaking of holiday, how do you think about, holiday 20 in terms of, what retailers can do to ensure a strong holiday? How do they think about demand forecasting? And, we've heard a lot of, really interesting ideas, right? This idea of opening up dark stores to hold merchandise as, consumers, basically do their own kind of last mile. What are you thinking of for this year? And are you seeing anything that's, kind of truly out of the box thinking?
I mean, I think there's a lot of components that are there that companies need to leverage, and they've been there. And I think a couple things. One, we've been talking about digital transformation in supply chain for years. And I think companies have seen it for years as a competitive advantage, right? So again, retailers have a lot of times focused on that final mile, but those that could really transform the rest of the supply chain have that competitive advantage and flexibility. I think what we're seeing now is companies need that more than ever. And those same tools that gave the competitive advantage, just running a better supply chain, you really need in this environment where there's so much variability and uncertainty, and we have these shocks, right? Whether it's, weather related or trade related or COVID related, how do I really respond to that? And so if I'm going to get visibility and enable fulfillment everywhere in my supply chain and make sure I'm getting for this holiday season, again, with all the changes going on globally, well, where is their demand, right? That demand signal is going to be very different than it was in the past. So again, to get that latest sense of demand, you really need modern machine learning based planning and forecasting. And then to flexibly fill supply, I need to look at inventory, to your point, at different stores, dark stores, not my traditional warehouses, but also those maintained at third-party warehouses. And also what's available at my supplier that I could ship sooner or direct ship, right? So you need better visibility throughout all those supply chain inventory points.
Yeah, I mean, that's truly right. This whole idea of, leveraging end-to-end visibility and, thinking about why they need it this year more than in the past, I think is, really, kind of table stakes. And then, I think there's always been this, trying to measure, investment into supply chain and balancing that with ROI. How do you kind of think about that from a, kind of 10,000 foot view?
Yeah, I mean, what we see, from our customers in the market is there's a lot of inefficiencies in supply chain. And, to keep up with today's business where you need that speed and agility, you don't want to do that by holding a bunch of inventory, and you don't want to expedite everything, right? So to have a better run supply chain, again, by connecting to a network and automating processes, companies increase productivity, reduce overall operating costs, but also what we've seen significant reduction in things like transportation costs, right? Better visibility, acting sooner, you're reducing those expedites, right? You're reducing things stuck in detention and demurrage. Direct ships and better planning on receiving companies are reducing warehousing costs. And by better visibility and flexibility with inventory, our customers, reduce inventory, significantly free up working capital. And on working capital, like I mentioned a couple minutes ago, I can extend my payment terms without impacting suppliers to help with that working capital by offering them financing. So we see, every company that goes to transform different parts of their supply chain, whether it's their global trade processes, whether it's getting better visibility into product availability to meet customer demand or visibility into shipments, we see that they, have significant performance increases as far as reducing costs, increasing speed, ensuring on time and full to help ensure sales, which obviously is key, and freeing up working capital. So every company we talk to does see significant benefits.
Yeah, I mean, if we go back to kind of the last crisis back in 2008, I do think some of what you mentioned around the banks and working capital, that wasn't necessarily in play. And I do think that that's why we've seen as strong of a supply chain network, right? This idea of these collaborative networks and collaborative supply chains, really hold together. I think that that's such an excellent point that you bring up, Heidi, and really critical, and maybe not one that the industry has kind of taken a step back and truly thought about. As as you think about advice, right, to espouse, around this idea of resilient supply chains and collaborative networks, if we go back to this idea of someone who's getting started, where would you tell them, kind of to start, and what advice do you have for retail right now?
Yep. So a couple things. So one, and just thinking about your time about financing, I think first, when companies think about supply chains, they really need to look at it holistically, think holistic about both the physical and the financial, right? Because what we've seen is if you don't have enough capital in the supply chain, right, you don't have it where it needs to be at the right time, you're not assuring supply and on-time delivery. So thinking about that more broadly. And then just in the two areas, so one is that collaborative supply chain network. So how do you automate those processes in both the physical and the financial supply chain to assure supply, ensure on-time delivery, and reduce and prevent stockouts by getting the right goods to the right place at the right time by significantly reducing costs, because all those processes in the supply chain have so much paper. There's so many handoffs in supply chain, right? So if you can connect those parties, what we see with companies is it's a digital process. You've eliminated paper and errors. You've ensured seamless handoffs. If you think about global transportation, how do I get it from origin over to my end customer? How do you make sure all those things are moving on time, and enabling flexibility if I need to reallocate it and process those, making sure those things happen to assure supply. And then again, on the demand side, I really think it's key to have ML-based, planning and forecasting. So you take that latest demand signal and you're getting the planning for the right product, the right place that you can deliver to in your supply chain. And by doing that, as things change, because they're changing at a rapid pace, the demand's shifting, your supply availability is shifting. How do you react to that quickly? So you really need to focus on those two pieces.
So I'll review the poll, and then we have a lot of questions from the audience.
Okay.
So I think it's really interesting, has your company digitized its supply chain, let's call it 50-50. I think what's the most interesting, and it goes to, your point, are you using AI ML? Only 1/3 are. Is that higher, or where is that versus what you expected, Heidi?
Depending on supply chains, I would say that's higher in some supply chains than others. But I think, about 1/3, because we've been, it's been available in many ways, and it depends, we're seeing it more in planning, we're seeing it more in predicting status of supply. So that's good to see. Actually, that's great. I think a poll like last year was on something else was less. So
no, we definitely saw less in, I think at the beginning of March. And then this is also very interesting, and probably, if I think of everything I've learned this week, probably the one point that's the most important is 17% of those who responded digitized during the crisis. And that really, it goes back to, I think, everything we've been talking about, this idea of resiliency and collaborative supply chains. It's really interesting. But I think the real kind of, number 4, do you feel like your supply chain could be more efficient? 100% said yes. Yeah.
And yeah. We see that everywhere, every prospect we talk to, every customer, it's supply chains have changed a lot. Everybody's outsourcing all the processes, all the documents, all the requirements. It's been very paper-based for years, and companies are on old legacy systems, which don't have that speed and flexibility that they need. So yeah, that makes sense to me.
So we have a very specific, I'm going to turn over to audience Q&A, and thank you everyone. If you have any additional questions, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. This is a very specific question, Heidi, but a great one. So we'll do our best together to answer. But this is from Brett. For an automated world, what type of hardware equipment is needed? Do you see the use of that equipment being used to onshore production to the US, and which companies will use it?
In an automated world, sorry, so
like a digitized world, I think what kind of hardware is needed, or is this more about, kind of software, helping, I think, from a supply chain perspective?
So mainly what we're seeing is software, right? And particularly, supply chains and collaborative supply chain networks, all those connection points and all those partners, you need that in one place. And a collaborative network like Infor and Infor Nexus is doing that work to connect all those partners and streamline all those processes. And we're doing that in the hosting and everything like so. Let's our customers focus on their business. We help run their supply chain.
That's very helpful. And then Monica has a question. Beginning from the first mile, what do you think as the key deterrents to supply chain? That's a good question. Collaboration among stakeholders, primarily around data sharing.
I think connecting and getting access to all that information as real time as possible, right? There's a tremendous amount of connection points to get that data. You have to connect to the various carriers, you have to connect to the suppliers, you have to connect to all the logistics providers to get that information in a timely manner, right? So being able to get that, and what we're seeing is a shift. You can't really wait for those providers to give you the updates. You really kind of need to, and this is what we do with their network, you want to be able to reach out and get those updates and get that real-time visibility. So a lot is all that connection of those parties is the key. And I mean, depending on what the process is and what information you're trying to get, it's what level of transparency are those partners willing to share. And we are seeing that improve significantly because I think everyone sees that it's the benefit of everybody to share information.
So Gary asked, what is unique about Infor Solutions in the supply chain automation world?
Yep. So a couple things. So Infor in general, you know, we have a comprehensive suite of all supply chain applications, everything from, I'll call them enterprise systems, from planning and warehouse, but also a connected supply chain network, which is really key. And as I mentioned, 80% of all data and processes is outside any single enterprise. And the other thing is, and I mentioned it before, and I think it really is a differentiator and significant in its importance, is that when you look at supply chains, to really optimize the overall performance of supply chains, to truly assure supply, you really need to manage both the physical and the financial aspects of the supply chain. It can't just be one or the other, and they can't be in separate places because they are tightly integrated. That same order is going to my suppliers and they invoice against, that's how they get paid. And that order is also what they're producing and what's being shipped against. To have all these things in separate systems is just unoptimal. And companies really can't maximize overall performance unless they do that in one place.
That's very helpful. And then we have from Sally, I would like to know more about new technologies and automation for apparel manufacturing.
Well, I'll focus on, I mean, there's lots. I mean, I'm going to focus more on, you know, what we have as Infor and our network. I mean, just really what we've been spending a great deal of time on is, you know, to run better supply chains and to run competitive supply chains and really, you know, identify what are new products and new patterns. It really requires really good supply chain data. So you have that, you need that digital supply chain. And then what we're doing with that data is we're, you know, very much focused on the science aspects, applying machine learning and intelligence to find insights for our customers. So, you know, to an apparel manufacturer, you know, what are the right products to make and where do I need them? And then are they going to get there on time and being responsive? So we've been very focused on, there's a lot of rich data. And supply chains are very complex and it's across different systems. So you can't really optimize that unless you have that end-to-end visibility, all the data in one place, apply machine learning to have those opportunities and to sense and respond to the latest issues or opportunities in your supply chain.
Great. I think we have time for 2 more questions. So we have a question from Jen. Have you worked on developed software that has united your supply chain to help monitor the process and let you pivot for production?
Yes, because what we do is with the supply chain network, you're connected. And what we do is we let companies focus on determining where do I have production, what's running on time, what's running late. And if I need to pivot that and add another production facility, quickly connecting them up, right? So, you know, companies don't have to worry about those connections and planning that, right? We kind of take that burden off for them. They don't have to build all those connections with those different facilities and get all that information. We do that. They can focus on, okay, where am I to get the most production? If I'm shifting to different countries, easily adding them to the network. And if that doesn't change their visibility, now it's just a different source and just makes that easier for them.
Great. Okay, last question from John. With 80% of the processes outside the enterprise, How digitalized are these processes and how difficult is it to integrate them? Good question.
Yeah, I mean, what we've seen is there's still a lot of, even when we connect companies to the network, there's still processes that are manual outside of what we've done. So it's a continuous journey. But what we find with our customers is once we connect a company, a retailer with their, suppliers and manufacturers and logistics providers, we can automate and streamline a number of those processes, let's say 80%, and then they keep adding on. So what we find with our customers is, hey, I've got this new process, which we either build core applications or we have an extensibility platform. So we have a number of customers, there's a process that we don't have a core application for, and they quickly, rapidly develop it and deploy it. So our goal with our customers is to get it to be digital as possible across their entire supply chain. I don't know if we'll ever get to 100% because there's always a new process and new data, but we're trying to get, close.
Well, and I think this whole idea around supply chain, right? I mean, it's still very new in terms of companies thinking about where to invest, how to invest, and also even just internally from a kind of, human capital perspective. So I think that, obviously based on the amount of questions, and I apologize to everyone whose questions we haven't been able to get to, but Heidi, thank you so much. I feel like we just scratched the surface of and probably one of the most important topics, especially as we go into holiday. And very much appreciated your insights, and hope to be able to kind of rethink strategies for retailers as we look at 2021 and beyond. Everyone who joined us on the call, thank you so much. Thanks for all your great questions. And
Thank you.
And looking forward to having Heidi on again soon. Thank you, Heidi.
Great. Thank you. Great spending
Take care.
the day.
Bye-bye.
Bye.